Well, good morning, everybody. It's great to see your bright and shining faces all over America this morning as we celebrate the feast of St. Francis of Assisi. In so many churches around the world today, people bring their pets of all shapes and sizes to church in a building and get them blessed by their pastors or priests. Because it's a day that we give thanks to God, not just for all creatures of our God and King, but the relationships that we have formed with those animals, both in our house, in our land, and around us in nature. We talked about this a little bit a couple of weeks ago on National Hug Your Hound Day. There's a special bond that God put in our hearts with the animals of the kingdom that He created, not just dogs, but cats and all the other animals that we have in our homes, but also those of us who are those people who are fortunate and blessed enough to live in rural areas to have those kinds of relationships with larger mammals and animals of God's kingdom. Just the other day, I can't remember where we were, but just the other day, we were talking with someone who said that she had a regular chance to go visit a family member who had a ranch with cows on it and just loved to be able to go stand by the cows and occasionally pet them because it immediately lowered her blood pressure and kind of lowered the stress and anxiety in her life. I find the same thing. Rebecca and I have driven a lot in the month of September, concluding with a trip home from Atlanta yesterday. And earlier in the month, we were talking about something going on that was emotion, a little stress attached to it. And I said, let's talk about this in a minute. Right now, we're passing a herd of cattle. Let's just look at the cows. And it does. It kind of creates this relation. God creates this relationship between us and the animals that only He understands, that He can explain. In the book of Genesis, He gives us dominion over all things on earth, including the animals. That's why we get to name them and, in many cases, domesticate them and call them pets. But so many cases, we find that the blessing is not so much that we have dominion over the animals, but we are able to form this relationship with them that makes us recognize that we are all creatures of our God and King. St. Francis of Assisi totally got this. Born in the late 12th century and passing away and going up into heaven sometime around 1225, 1226, St. Francis came to the earth and to the nation of Italy at a critical time in the history of the church. Not only did he see all the wealth in the church and the monasteries around him in Assisi, which is about 80 miles north of Rome, but it was at a time where the church was fabulously wealthy, and he would determine later inappropriately wealthy. He asked God to guide him in how to reform the church, and the Lord told him in very certain terms that he should get married to what he called throughout his life Lady Poverty. I'm using air quotes because there's a Latin phrase for that, sacrum commercium, or something to that effect. But basically, it meant that he was going to forsake all things, all property of any sort. In fact, he got in trouble with his dad, who was relatively wealthy, for having this kind of attitude, and literally in front of the bishop of their town took off all his clothes, and to the bishop's embarrassment just stood there naked and said, "I don't want anything." The bishop gave him a rough garment. He took a piece of rope from a scarecrow outside the church, tied it on, and started walking around that part of Italy preaching the gospel. It wasn't long before he gathered a group of 10 or 11 others, makes for a nice number, to just preach the gospel and walk around that part of Italy, sharing with others the good news of Jesus Christ. And so it was in this early kind of band of followers, very much like Jesus, 1100, 1200 years earlier, that St. Francis basically said, I'm going to just do what Jesus did. And so the original rule of the Franciscan monks, the original rule of the order of St. Francis was very simple. Preach the gospel and follow in Jesus' footsteps. It's pretty straightforward. But they followed along this lesson that we just heard from Luke a couple of weeks ago, and that is where Jesus tells the rich young ruler, you can't serve God and two masters. Give away all your possessions and follow me. Well, St. Francis and his band of merry brothers did that in a very literal way. They turned begging into the way that they subsisted, and they followed very strictly the lesson from the Gospels where Jesus sends out the 12 and then later the 70 by saying, take nothing with you, no staff, nothing but the sandals on your feet, no purse, no bag, and rely and subsist specifically on the goodness of others. It was in this way that Francis grew this movement throughout Italy, and at one point became so popular around Italy that he felt called to go to the Pope in Rome and ask for his blessing to create this order in a formal way. That happened in 1209. And Francis is blessed to have done this. There were various movements of reform, even in these early days. I mean, remember, Martin Luther was 300 years after this, right? But there were still early movements of reform in these days. And the two previous kind of groups of folks that had opposed the wealth of the church and the way the church was operating were completely squelched in what we now call the Inquisition. And so Francis was very blessed to have been kind of endorsed and ratified by the Pope, who pronounced them a mendicant order. And between Francis and the Franciscans and St. Dominic and the Dominicans, we got our first two groups of monks that now, even 800 years later, are still around today. So why do we associate Francis with the animals? We talked about this a lot last year on St. Francis Day, but just to refresh your memory, the two big stories that we always associate with St. Francis, and if you look at statue depictions of him, stained glass windows, any kind of artwork, you will almost always see a bird or two in his hands or on his shoulders, maybe a rabbit and a wolf. The reason that's the case is St. Francis, and the reason he wrote this poem that was our opening hymn to this morning, All Creatures of Our God and King, had a direct relationship with the animals around him that allowed him to think of them as equals. And so he would refer to the brother bird or the sister rabbit or the brother wolf. And in that way, not only referred to them as his equals and subservient to our God and King, but preached the gospel to them on a regular basis. All kinds of Christian legends from this part of Italy and later Europe, as the order increased in popularity, tell of St. Francis preaching the gospel, for instance, to a herd of cattle. People probably thought he was insane. And yet, this relationship that he had with the animals not only ultimately became associated where he and the animals are synonymous, it shows us that we too can have this kind of relationship with nature. I tried it out on my walk this morning. I know y'all often enjoyed the stories I talk about my walk this morning. Before it started raining outside, I went outside to get some fresh air and think about how to convey in the sermon the story of St. Francis. Encountered a little green frog, less than the size of the last digit on my thumb, a giant heron who squawked like a pterodactyl, a couple of Shih Tzus, a couple of Pomeranians, and of course, cowboy. And it's fun. I encourage you all to do this today to celebrate St. Francis Day. Refer them all as brother or sister. Now, when I refer to brother cowboy, he just kind of looks at me in a sleepy way. I'll show y'all afterwards. He's already taken his seat in my seat here at Online Home Church. But boy, those Shih Tzus loved it. When I said, good morning, brother Shih Tzu, good morning, sister Shih Tzu, which is kind of hard to say, man, they howled and yapped and alarmed their owners to the point where they came outside to see what the intrusion was all about. I said, I'm just telling them happy St. Francis Day, and they're responding in kind. Be prepared for people to look at you like you're crazy. But it's fun because it helps us remember not only the way St. Francis treated the animals of the world, but our relationship with them, which is so unique through the blessing of God above. That's the reason we see Francis with birds and rabbits and the occasional squirrel, like at Christ Church in Tuscaloosa, and that statue out in the courtyard. The reason he's associated with the wolf is that St. Francis also had a power, a holy and miraculous power over certain animals. There was a village near Assisi which was getting terrorized by a wolf. The wolf would come in and take chickens. The wolf would come in and take small animals. And the townspeople are afraid that they were going to be attacked. And in fact, one of them was bitten by this wolf. Francis encountered the wolf and said, Brother Wolf, you and I need to talk. And he preached the gospel to that wolf. The legend is that the wolf laid down and submitted to St. Francis and agreed to never attack the village again. So when you see in a stained glass window in a cathedral or in a painting of St. Francis with the wolf at his knee, it's because he intervened on behalf of the people of that town and used the holy power that he had to convince this wolf to exist in a peaceful way with the folks in that village. The other thing that St. Francis is known for, because he's the patron saint of all animals, He's the patron saint, of course, of the country of Italy. And so I hope for those of you who are fixing to go to Italy on Tuesday, you will at least look for some depiction of St. Francis, if not have the opportunity to go to Assisi, which is a short train ride from downtown Rome. But he's also the patron saint of the environment, or patron saint of ecology. For those of you who have gardens, a statue of St. Francis is not necessarily required, but certainly encouraged, because it will help your plants grow in the way that the bounty of nature grew around him in his times. He would regularly walk among the fields of olive trees and almond trees and artichoke groves in that part of Italy, and then later all over Europe, blessing the fruit of the vine, the fruit of the tree, and those around him, so that he became synonymous not just with the relationship that we have with animals, but with the bounty that God has given us through our earth here. And so we said, including Rebecca and I both are blessed with brown thumbs, but man, we got that statue of St. Francis out there where our garden should be, should we tend to grow it one day. And for those of you who do have gardens, I think at least a couple of members of our congregation do. If you do have a garden with a St. Francis statue, that's a good move, because it is through the way that he tended to nature that we know we can likewise as well and experience the bounty that God has given us. So before we go and start blessing our animals this morning, I want to spend one word on the gospel this morning from Luke. Jesus, when he talks to his apostles who are asking the question of him more in terms of a demand. Notice when you go back and look at our readings this morning, the apostles don't ask, would you please increase our faith? The story from Luke is, increase our faith, with an exclamation point. They're demanding that Jesus help them grow their faith. And what does he say? If any of you had the faith that even is as small as a mustard seed, which St. Francis, and of course Jesus and the apostles knew, was one of the tiniest seeds in all of God's bounty and nature. But then you could tell this mulberry tree to uproot itself and move. The tiniest little bit of faith can accomplish the greatest things. And this is what St. Francis accomplished in his life. From this little group of men in Italy, he grew to a global movement of people who committed to spreading the gospel of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ around the globe. And here, 800 years later, we still have Franciscan monks all over. But I don't think St. Francis would have realized that the faith that he had, that tiny little mustard seed that he had of faith 800 years ago, would still now be celebrated in a country he had no idea of, the United States of America, 800 years later, and that we would be talking about having statue depictions of him in our gardens today. So the legacy of St. Francis continues on, not just in the way we relate to our loved ones and our animals, but in the way that we tend to God's nature and his blessings that he gives us, as we are all his creatures of our God and King.